Welcome to Moonlight Audiobook. Tonight, we enter a world where appearances deceive, where every glance hides a secret, and where truth lies buried beneath layers of silence. This is Hercule Poirot, the mystery of Mrs. McGinty's dead. Let me know in the comments where in the world you are tuning in from. Settle in with a warm drink, let the lamps burn low, and allow yourself to be drawn into a mystery where nothing is as it first appears. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Quiet Arrival at Belfort Hall. The village of Broadhinny lay beneath a thin veil of February frost, its thatched roofs silvered in the weak sunlight and its narrow lanes muffled under a hush that belonged to places which rarely saw change. It was, at least to the casual observer, an entirely unremarkable place. The church tower kept its patient watch, the grocer's shop smelt faintly of dried tea and paraffin oil, and the villagers, sturdy in their opinions and habits, could trace the rhythms of their days back for decades. Yet, for all its tranquility, the air was not as still as it seemed. On that particular morning, a tremor of unease rippled beneath the customary greetings and neighborly nods. Curtains twitched a moment longer than politeness demanded. Voices dropped as footsteps passed by. Something had happened, something grim enough to fracture the comfortable monotony of Broadhinny. The source of this disquiet lay in the small, whitewashed cottage at the edge of the village green, home to Mrs. McGinty, the elderly charwoman whose life was an unremarkable pattern of service, gossip, and penny-pinching economy. She was known to all, liked by some, tolerated by others, and owed favors by many. But 2 nights earlier, her lifeless body had been discovered on her kitchen floor, her head struck by a heavy, blunt instrument. Nothing about her quiet life suggested enemies, and yet, someone had killed her. It was the grocer's delivery boy who had raised the alarm, finding the back door ajar and the milk untouched since the day before. Constable Reeves, flustered but determined, had hurried to the scene and, within hours, the small parlor of Mrs. McGinty's cottage was filled with the awkward bustle of official investigation. A drawer in her bedroom had been forced open. A small sum of money was missing. Robbery, the police concluded, an ugly but straightforward business. The village, however, was not so easily convinced. Broadhinny's gossip ran swift and deep, and before long, speculation sprouted like weeds. An itinerant laborer seen loitering near the station, a man from the next parish with a record for petty theft, or perhaps, whispered with an almost scandalous relish, someone much closer to home. By the following afternoon, the matter had moved from local rumor to official charge. James Bentley, Mrs. McGinty's lodger, a diffident young man with little to recommend him beyond his quiet manners, had been arrested. He had no alibi for the time of death, no funds to speak of, and his manner under questioning had been, in the inspector's words, shifty. The case appeared watertight to everyone except Superintendent Spence. It was Spence who had sent the letter. A letter addressed in a neat, unhurried hand to a certain gentleman residing in London. Its contents were brief but weighted, a request for assistance in a matter where the facts, though apparently settled, refused to sit comfortably. A man's life hung in the balance, and Spence was not entirely convinced it was the right man. So it was that, 2 days later, a small, impeccably dressed Belgian alighted from the afternoon train at the nearest station, a walking stick in one gloved hand and a valise in the other. His moustaches, luxuriant, symmetrical, and cared for with the precision of a watchmaker, gleamed faintly in the pale sun. Hercule Poirot, master of private detection, had come to Broadhinny. As he made his way towards the waiting motorcar, Poirot's eyes swept over the landscape with the attentive curiosity of a man who missed nothing. The slant of a roof, the uneven path of a lane, the way 2 villagers conversed with their heads bent close together, all these he noted and filed away. The case of Mrs. McGinty's death, he thought, was not going to be solved by the fingerprints on a cash box or the marks on a kitchen floor. It would require something far more delicate. the examination of human hearts, with all their fears, envies, and petty deceits. The driver cleared his throat nervously. "Inspector Spence is expecting you, sir. He's at the police station." Poirot inclined his head. "Then let us not keep the good superintendent waiting. For when a man is condemned, there is no time to lose, and I think, mon ami, that here there is something out of place." The motorcar jolted forward, carrying him towards the heart of the village, and into the midst of a web of small lies, sharp resentments, and one very deliberate act of murder. Chapter 2. Shadows in the Morning Room. The Broad Hinny police station, a modest brick structure more reminiscent of a village schoolhouse than a place of law, carried the faint scent of ink and damp paper. Superintendent Spence, a tall, spare man with a soldier's bearing, had prepared a list for Poirot, a carefully chosen circle of names whose lives had brushed, crossed, or collided with that of Mrs. McGinty. It was a short list, but in villages such as Broad Hinny, brevity meant precision. Strangers were remembered, small quarrels lingered, habits and reputations were catalogued in the minds of neighbors with a quiet thoroughness that rivaled any police file. Within that circle of familiarity lay the certainty that Mrs. McGinty's killer had not come from far away. The first figure in the chain was James Bentley, the lodger who had already been tried and condemned. A young man of nervous disposition and pale complexion, Bentley's manner was awkward, his eyes sliding away from steady regard. His life in Broad Hinny had been marked by reserve, by a curious inability to settle into the easy rhythm of village life. The evidence against him was, to the formal mind, compelling: the absence of an alibi, the proximity to the scene, the disappearance of a small sum of money. Yet, there lingered an indefinable quality about him, something that did not align neatly with the brutal, decisive act that had ended Mrs. McGinty's life. From Bentley, the line of inquiry extended to Mrs. Laura Upward, the widow of a colonial official whose standing in the village was unquestioned. Tall, imperious, and possessed of an incisive mind, she presided over her home with a degree of formality that made her a figure of both respect and quiet caution. Mrs. McGinty had been employed by her for occasional tasks, a working arrangement conducted without familiarity. There was a polished civility in all that Mrs. Upward did, yet beneath it, perhaps, a capacity for cool judgment unclouded by sentiment. Then came Dr. Rendell, the village physician. In his 40s and brisk in his professional habits, he was a man accustomed to being called upon in moments of distress, accustomed also to keeping his own counsel. Mrs. McGinty had been in good health, and the nature of her injury had left no doubt as to the deliberate intention behind it. The doctor's life was one of routine calls, quiet consultations, and a network of connections to every household in Broad Hinny. Connections which, in times of violence, could conceal as much as they revealed. At Long Meadows, a once elegant house now in a perpetual state of gentle disarray, lived Mrs. Maureen Summerhays. Her days were a blend of domestic chaos and genial hospitality, the rooms filled with the movement of children, the clutter of everyday life, and the shifting company of houseguests. Mrs. McGinty had assisted her from time to time, though the arrangement had been more casual than formal. The warmth of the household's welcome could not entirely mask the fact that, in such a setting, alibis became vague and the boundaries of memory indistinct. Lastly, there was Deirdre Henderson, a young woman employed as secretary to Mrs. Upward. Reserved in manner, deliberate in her movements, she gave the impression of someone accustomed to standing slightly apart, observing rather than participating. Her connection to Mrs. McGinty was less direct, yet proximity in a small village often bred knowledge of matters unspoken, of tensions that others might overlook. As the names formed into a pattern in Poirot's mind, they sketched the outline of a closed circle, individuals linked not only to the victim but, in subtler ways, to each other. Every one of them lived within easy reach of the cottage where Mrs. McGinty had met her end. Each possessed the opportunity, in some measure, to commit the act. And each, in their own way, carried a private shadow, a concealed thought, an unspoken motive, or a fragment of truth they would prefer to keep undiscovered. Poirot knew from long practice that in such a circle, the surface rarely told the truth. Somewhere beneath the polite exchanges, the village cordiality, and the neat facades, lay the discordant note, the small thing out of place that would, when found, unravel the whole. Chapter 3. Whispers over afternoon tea. The afternoon train from London slid into the small country station with an unhurried clatter, as though time itself had adjusted to the slower pulse of Hampshire life. The February light was pale, the sky faintly veiled by cloud, and the air carried that thin, clean chill which sharpened the senses without freezing them. From the carriage stepped a small, immaculately dressed man, his posture upright, his movements precise. Hercule Poirot had a way of occupying space that drew the eye without force. There was an order to his presence, a harmony of detail from the tilt of his hat to the shine of his shoes. He paused briefly on the platform, his gaze sweeping over the station with quiet exactness, noting the man with a folded newspaper who did not read it, the luggage left carelessly near a bench, the station-master's glance towards the road before returning to his duties. The waiting motor-car took him through narrow, winding lanes bordered by hedgerows bare of leaves. Villages, Poirot reflected, wore their histories openly to the trained observer. The weathered lintels above the doors, the repaired patch in a thatched roof, the uneven tilt of a gatepost. Broad Hinny was no different. As they approached, the village presented itself in muted tones. Stone cottages with low windows, the church tower standing like a sentinel, and the green at its center lying quiet beneath a pale frost. Superintendent Spence greeted him at the police station, his manner brisk but tinged with relief. In a few spare words, he outlined the essentials: the conviction of James Bentley, the absence of firm physical evidence, the missing money, the witness statements that seemed sound and yet failed to settle into a coherent whole. Poirot listened without interruption, his eyes fixed steadily on the superintendent, as if drawing each detail into an invisible framework of thought. Leaving the station, Poirot chose to walk through the village before retiring to his lodgings. He observed the small particulars others would overlook, the way certain curtains twitched at his passing, the faint scuff of boots in the soft verge by the green, the distance between the post office and the path leading to Mrs. McGinty's cottage. These were not idle observations. To Poirot, each element had its place in the pattern, and patterns, once complete, yielded truth. When he reached the cottage itself, Poirot paused before entering. The front garden was modest, a few shrubs with their branches bare, a narrow path leading to the door. The latch, newly repaired, bore faint scratches, not deep, but recent. Inside, the air held the scent of coal dust and lavender polish, overlaid by the faintest trace of something metallic. The furnishings were plain, the rooms kept in order by a hand that valued neatness. Yet here and there, Poirot's eye caught the irregularity. A chair not aligned with its mate, a rug fractionally askew, the faint shadow of something once kept on a now bare shelf. In the small kitchen where Mrs. McGinty had met her end, Poirot stood very still. He examined the worn flagstones, the simple table with its scrubbed surface, the single shelf of crockery. The space was unremarkable, and yet it was here that violence had entered, violence without warning, sudden and final. He considered the nature of such an act. It was rarely born in a moment. More often it was the end point of a chain, each link forged by resentment, fear, or gain. As the afternoon faded into the muted blue of early evening, Poirot returned to his lodgings. There, seated beside a small fire, he laid out his plan with the precision of a chess player. The coming days would be devoted to the careful study of each figure in the circle, their histories, their habits, and their small inconsistencies. Physical evidence might be scant, But the minds and hearts of men and women, Poirot knew, bore the marks of their actions more clearly than any fingerprint. The game had begun, and in Broadhinny's quiet lanes and tidy parlors, the truth was waiting to be found. Chapter 4. The Locked Study. The next morning broke grey and cool, with a faint mist clinging to the hedgerows. Poirot began his work without fanfare. The interviews, he decided, would be conducted in an order of his own choosing, not dictated by rank, proximity, or convenience, but by the quiet logic of cause and effect. He would move from the outer edges of the circle towards its heart, listening not only to what was said, but to what the silences between words might betray. The first visit was to Mrs. Laura Upward. Her house stood slightly apart from the main cluster of the village, a tall and dignified building whose gardens, though dormant in winter, bore the signs of attentive care. Inside, the arrangement of the rooms reflected their owner. Precise, orderly, each item chosen for effect. Poirot observed the smoothness with which Mrs. Upward's manner shifted between formality and cordiality, and the slight tightening at the corners of her mouth when certain subjects arose. It was the kind of controlled poise that could conceal irritation as readily as it did grief. From there, Poirot proceeded to Long Meadows. Mrs. Maureen Summerhays received him with the careless warmth of a hostess accustomed to improvisation. The hallway bore the detritus of daily life, coats on chairs, papers on tables, and a faint aroma of baking drifted from the kitchen. Yet even here, amid the apparent informality, Poirot detected an undercurrent, a watchfulness in the eyes, a tendency to divert attention from specifics to generalities. The interview yielded little of substance, but much in tone, and tone was often the more revealing. Dr. Rendell's surgery came next. The cramped waiting room, with its worn chairs and tidy stack of magazines, spoke of a steady practice built over years. The doctor's manner was brisk, efficient, the voice of a man who measured his time in precise increments. He answered questions with apparent frankness, yet Poirot noted the faintest shift in posture when the matter of the murder weapon was raised. It was not avoidance, exactly, but a subtle reserve, as though certain possibilities had been considered and set aside without full disclosure. Poirot's meeting with Deirdre Henderson took place at Mrs. Upward's house, where she was engaged in her clerical duties. The young woman's composure was remarkable. Her hands moved steadily over her work, her gaze met Poirot's without wavering. Yet her answers carried a spareness, as if each had been weighed before being offered, pared down to the necessary minimum. It was not hostility, but a kind of guardedness, the reflex of someone accustomed to keeping the inner life separate from the outer. Finally, Poirot arranged a brief conversation with the village constable who had first attended the scene. Constable Reeves was a man of earnest disposition, quick to recount the physical details of the discovery. In his account, Poirot found nothing that contradicted Spence's earlier summary, and yet, there was a certain imprecision in the constable's recollection of the state of the room, a detail too easily dismissed as trivial. Poirot filed it away with the rest. By late afternoon, the pattern of the day's encounters had begun to take shape in Poirot's mind. Each meeting had offered more in the manner than in the matter. A fleeting hesitation, a calculated deflection, a certain overemphasis on alibi or innocence. Alone, such details were fragments. Together, they began to form the faint outline of something concealed. As evening settled over Broadhinny, Poirot sat in the small sitting room of his lodgings, the fire burning low. In his notebook, he recorded the day's observations, not in the order they had occurred, but according to a private sequence known only to himself. The village, to all appearances, remained unchanged. The church bell marked the hour, windows glowed faintly in the dusk, and the lanes lay quiet. But beneath that calm surface, Poirot sensed the first stirrings of unease. The little grey cells, as always, had begun their quiet work. Chapter 5. An Uneasy Gathering. The following day dawned with a deceptive brightness, a pale winter sun lending a temporary cheer to the frost-hardened lanes. Yet in the offices of the county constabulary, the mood was one of self-congratulation. Inspector Spence's successor in the field, a man of conscientious temperament but little taste for ambiguity, had arrived at a conclusion he deemed both logical and unassailable. The suspect was Mrs. Maureen Summerhayes. Her name had emerged from a tangle of small observations: her proximity to Mrs. McGinty's cottage, her unaccounted hour on the evening of the murder, and the faint but undeniable tension in her manner when questioned about the victim. A neighbor had now stepped forward to recall seeing her pass along the lane shortly before the estimated time of death, a fact which, when set beside the earlier statements, formed a neat, satisfying pattern. The matter of motive, too, was addressed with confidence. Mrs. McGinty, it was suggested, had stumbled upon an unflattering truth about her neighbor's past, a truth of sufficient embarrassment to provoke a desperate act. The precise nature of this knowledge was left vague, but the constable spoke of hints and whispers, and in a village such as Broadhinny, whispers often sufficed. It was at this point that Poirot, seated quietly at the back of the room, allowed his gaze to drift towards the frost-rimmed window. The reasoning presented was tidy, yes, but too tidy. It was the sort of arrangement that, in its symmetry, betrayed the hand of construction rather than the messiness of life. When the meeting concluded, the local inspector took Poirot aside, his voice low with the confidence of one who has anticipated agreement. "It fits, M. Poirot. Everything points to her. A charge could be laid within the week." Poirot inclined his head politely, his fingertips brushing together. "It is true, mon ami, that everything points to her, and that is precisely why I do not believe it." He declined to elaborate. Instead, he returned to the lanes of Broadhinny, his pace unhurried. He paused once outside Mrs. McGinty's cottage, regarding the narrow path to the door, the hedges that flanked it, and the window from which one might see the approach of any visitor. The stillness of the place was complete, save for the faint creak of a gate somewhere in the distance. To Poirot's mind, the theory against Mrs. Summerhayes lacked the small, untidy imperfection that marked genuine truth. It was, he reflected, like a jigsaw puzzle into which the final piece had been forced into place. Superficially correct, yet subtly wrong. The question, then, was not whether Mrs. Summerhayes had killed Mrs. McGinty, for Poirot was certain she had not, but whose hand had so carefully arranged the picture to make her appear as though she had. That hand, he knew, belonged to someone in the village, and that someone was watching, even now, to see whether the trap had sprung as intended. Chapter 6: Footsteps in the Corridor. Poirot chose, on the morning that followed, not to pursue further formal interviews. Instead, he appeared in the village with a deliberate aimlessness, pausing in shop doorways, exchanging pleasantries at garden gates, and lingering over tea in the small cafe that overlooked the green. His manner was unhurried, almost idle, yet his eyes missed nothing. He began with Mrs. Upward. The visit was framed as a social courtesy, a discussion of French novels and the deplorable decline in coffee quality. Poirot allowed the conversation to meander until, with the lightest shift, he spoke of village gossip, the way it travels, changes shape, and sometimes grows dangerous in the wrong hands. Mrs. Upward's response was calm, but her hand, resting on the arm of her chair, tightened momentarily upon the fabric. It was the smallest movement, yet to Poirot it spoke of a chord struck unexpectedly close to the heart. From there, he called upon Dr. Rendell under the pretext of mild neuralgia. While the doctor prepared a prescription, Poirot remarked upon the curious way in which a patient's secrets, their ailments, their habits, were entrusted to a physician. Such knowledge, he mused, could be as potent as any weapon. Dr. Rendell smiled, but his gaze flickered for the briefest moment towards the drawer of his desk, as though something within had tugged at his attention. Poirot made no comment, merely inclining his head with the faintest suggestion of agreement, and left. At Long Meadows, Mrs. Summerhayes greeted him in the chaotic hallway. Poirot accepted a cup of tea and made genial talk of domestic inconveniences, a missing teapot lid, the unpredictability of the hot water boiler. Then, in the midst of her laughter, he observed softly that an innocent person, wrongly accused, often betrays their innocence not in words but in the absence of artifice. Her expression, for the space of a heartbeat, grew still. She asked if he referred to her. Poirot merely smiled and declared himself a philosopher, avoiding any answer. In the afternoon, Poirot walked along the lane past the post office, where Deirdre Henderson emerged with a sheaf of letters. He fell into step beside her, speaking of the curious efficiency of the postal service, how swiftly a letter could reach its intended hands, and how easily it might also be misdelivered. She replied with composure, but Poirot saw the faintest narrowing of her eyes when he remarked that some letters, once read, could never be forgotten. These were not interrogations, nor were they designed to yield confessions. They were, rather, the placement of small weights upon a delicate balance, to see which minds tilted, which steadied, and which betrayed the strain. That evening, in the quiet of his lodging, Poirot considered what he had learned. The guilty, he reflected, often fear the direct question least of all, for it can be met with a rehearsed denial. It is the passing remark, the idle speculation, the half-light of implication that unsettles them. For guilt is a poor sleeper, easily woken by the faintest rustle in the dark. Chapter 7. The Midnight Alarm. The frost had deepened overnight, turning the rutted lanes to pale ribbons of glass. The village awoke under a thin veil of mist, its chimneys exhaling in slow, uncertain breaths. By 9 o'clock, the usual rhythm of Broad Hinny, the opening of shop shutters, the muffled sound of kettles boiling, had been broken by the arrival of a single, panicked voice. It came from the direction of the Larches, the home of Mrs. Upward. Her housemaid, pale and dishevelled, had stumbled into the high street, speaking in a tone both hurried and broken, as though fearful of the words themselves. Within minutes, half the village had gathered to hear her trembling account. Mrs. Upward had been found in her drawing-room, slumped in the corner chair, her head at an unnatural angle. Poirot arrived soon after the constable, his gait measured, his eyes taking in the scene before stepping across the threshold. The air inside was faintly scented with violets, a perfume that seemed oddly at odds with the sharp tang of coal smoke. Mrs. Upward's expression was frozen in surprise, her right hand still clutching the arm of the chair. A porcelain cup lay shattered on the rug, its contents absorbed into the deep pile, leaving only a dark bloom. There was no sign of forced entry. The doors were locked, the windows fastened. On a small side table rested a tray with a second cup, untouched, and a plate holding a solitary biscuit. To the casual observer, the matter might have been called a tragic accident, a sudden seizure or fainting fit. Yet Poirot's gaze lingered on the position of the cup fragments, the slight displacement of the side table, and the faint trace of a smudge upon the handle of the untouched cup. The village, already unsettled by Mrs. McGinty's death, now found itself gripped by a deeper, colder unease. That two women, each with her own web of acquaintances and secrets, should meet their end in such close succession could not be explained away by coincidence. As the constable took notes and murmured about summoning the coroner, Poirot stepped back into the hall. The frost still clung to the windows, turning the light to a dim opal. Somewhere beyond the mist lay the hand that had twice disturbed the peace of Broad Hinny. The second crime, he knew, was not an afterthought but a deliberate move, an attempt to close a door that Poirot had already begun to open. The murderer had acted again, and in doing so, had told Poirot far more than they intended. Chapter 8. The Second Darkness. The drawing-room at the Larches was emptied by early afternoon, the body removed with the solemn efficiency of the village doctor and constable. Yet Poirot remained, standing quite still in the patch of muted light that fell across the rug. The scent of violets lingered, faint but insistent, like the refrain of a song that will not leave the mind. He let his gaze travel slowly, deliberately, across each surface, not searching for the obvious but waiting for that elusive discord which always betrays the presence of a lie. His eyes rested once more upon the shattered porcelain cup. The fragments lay close together, as though dropped straight down rather than flung or spilled in surprise. A curious thing, too, that the largest piece bore no trace of liquid upon its inner curve, while the rug below showed a wide, irregular stain. Poirot's mind registered these details without outward sign. Instead, he moved to the side table, where the untouched cup sat upon its saucer. The handle bore a faint smudge, not of dust, but of something darker, more deliberate. One could overlook it easily, dismiss it as a shadow. Poirot, however, studied it with the quiet absorption of a man reading a sentence written in invisible ink. There was also the matter of the biscuits. On the plate, a single one remained, unbitten, untouched, yet its placement was strangely precise, as though it had been set down carefully rather than abandoned mid-reach. Such little acts, thought Poirot, spoke of a scene arranged after the fact, an imitation of casual life composed by a hand unaccustomed to the subtleties of domestic disorder. And then there was the scent. Not violets from a bottle upon the mantel, nor from the sachets that might be found in a lady's drawer. This fragrance had clung more faintly to the rim of the broken cup than to the air itself. A perfume mingled not with the wearer's skin but with something else entirely, something hot, dissolved, and meant to be swallowed. It was then, and only then, that the outline of a pattern began to form in Poirot's mind, not yet the whole picture, but enough to know that the threads of both deaths were now knotted together in his hand. He would not speak of it, not yet. The murderer still believed themselves to be unseen, and to disturb that illusion now would be premature. He left the larches quietly, stepping into the frost-bright afternoon, his thoughts ordered with the meticulous care of a chess player contemplating the final moves. Somewhere among the polite faces and carefully arranged words of Broadhinny lay the truth, and now Poirot possessed the one small piece that would make the entire puzzle visible. Chapter 9. Truths Half Hidden. The invitation had been delivered by hand, each card bearing the same polite request in Poirot's neat, foreign hand. Monsieur Hercule Poirot would be most obliged if you would attend a short meeting at the parlor of the Dog and Fox Inn, this evening at 7 o'clock. Matters of grave importance to the village will be discussed. By nightfall, the parlor's small fire glowed in its grate, throwing a steady warmth that failed to soften the tense chill among those gathered. The air was heavy with the scent of tobacco, damp wool, and something less tangible, that faint, metallic anticipation before a storm. They came in twos and ones, eyes quick and voices low. Mrs. Sweeterman, her gloved hands knotted in her lap. Dr. Rendell, outwardly composed but with a faint tightness about his mouth. Miss Henderson, angular and self-contained, her gaze moving from face to face as though counting them. Superintendent Spence stood in the corner, hands behind his back, a watchful presence. And there, seated in the high-backed chair nearest the fire, Poirot waited, small, neat, his eyes half-lidded yet missing nothing. The room's single window reflected the lamplight back upon them, turning each face into a pale oval against the dark. Conversation faltered. They looked, from time to time, at Poirot, waiting for the reason they had been called, waiting for the first blow to fall. When at last he spoke, it was not with accusation but with the quiet courtesy of a man discussing the weather. He thanked them for coming. He spoke of Mrs. McGinty, her modest life, her sudden death. He spoke of Mrs. Upward, her unexpected passing, so soon after. He did not raise his voice, nor did he point a finger. Instead, he allowed the silences between his sentences to lengthen, to weigh upon the room, until the stillness itself seemed to demand the truth. One by one, his eyes rested on each of them, as if measuring not the cut of their coat or the shape of their mouth, but the minute tremors of the mind that no garment can conceal. He mentioned details, small, insignificant to the casual listener. A newspaper left unfolded, a cup placed in the wrong position, a remark overheard and later denied. Each was a thread, and in Poirot's hands, the threads began to twist together, invisible yet unbreakable. They did not know, not yet, where his words were leading. But they felt it, as one feels the tide shifting beneath a calm sea. The noose was drawing in, and the man in the high-backed chair was the only one who knew, with absolute certainty, who would be caught within it. Chapter 10. The Garden of Secrets. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his fingertips pressed together, his gaze bright with a contained energy. The murmurs in the room had stilled. Only the ticking of the wall clock marked the seconds. "I have told you, Mesdames et Messieurs," he began softly, "that in matters of murder, it is the little thing that matters most, the little thing that does not fit." He turned his eyes briefly to the mantelpiece, as though drawing the threads into his mind before laying them out in order. Mrs. McGinty, he continued, was struck down in her humble kitchen. The police believed at once in theft, in a lodger with desperate need of money. But, his voice sharpened imperceptibly, the theft was crude, too crude. The coins scattered, the box open. Not the work of a thief, but of someone wishing us to believe in a thief. His gaze moved to the faces before him. And then, Mrs. Upward, so different a woman, so different a life. But again, the scene was arranged. A cup of chocolate, broken, but not spilled as it would be in shock. A biscuit laid down with care, not dropped in haste. These are not accidents. They are compositions, and the same hand arranged both. A movement at the far end of the table, the faint shift of a foot, the tightening of fingers around an armrest. Poirot saw it, and pressed on. It was not the obvious clue that told me. It was the perfume, violets, faint and artificial. Not the scent of a lady's toilette, but dissolved into the drink itself. Why? To conceal the presence of something else, a bitterness that would betray the poison. Mrs. McGinty did not drink such things. Mrs. Upward did. And so the murderer carried the method from one to the other, adapting the setting, trusting that we would see two crimes as separate. Poirot's voice became almost conversational. But there was another link, a scrap of gossip Mrs. McGinty overheard, a piece of the past long hidden. She had seen a photograph in the newspaper, recognized a face. That knowledge would have brought ruin, not in court, perhaps, but in society. And so, the silence was bought not with coins, but with her life. Mrs. Upward, knowing the same truth, was silenced in her turn. Now he rose, his small figure commanding the room by sheer force of certainty. The murderer is here. They are clever, but not so clever as they believe. They understood poison, staging, the psychology of suspicion, but they overlooked the smallest thing. A cup placed too neatly, a perfume where none belonged. And from that, mon ami, the whole truth unfolded. He spoke the name then, a quiet word, yet it struck the room like the crack of a whip. Gasps, denials, the sudden scrape of a chair. But Poirot only inclined his head, as if the matter were now concluded. Justice, Miss Amos, is an exercise in order. And order, always, will reveal the truth. Chapter 11. Hour of the Gathering. The name still hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the accused, pale, lips pressed into a tight, bloodless line, made a sudden turn toward the door. It was a foolish impulse. Superintendent Spence, who had remained like a statue in the corner, stepped forward with quiet speed, placing a firm hand on their shoulder. There was no struggle, only the faint, defeated sag of a body that knew the game was over. The handcuffs clicked shut, an oddly soft sound, yet final, like the closing of a coffin lid. Outside, the wind had risen, rattling the inn's windows as the police car waited. The suspect was led away without words, eyes fixed ahead, refusing to meet any other gaze. The villagers watched in silence. The only movement was Mrs. Sweeterman's trembling hand rising to her lips, as if to hold in a prayer or a gasp. Poirot remained seated until the door closed and the sound of the engine faded. Then he smoothed the line of his moustache and glanced at the small fire, which had burned down to embers. "It is always the same," he said at last, speaking almost to himself. "The crime, it begins with something small, a fear, a vanity, a jealousy, and it grows, until the mind believes murder to be the only solution. And yet," he tapped his temple gently, "it is the small thing that undoes them in the end." He rose, adjusting his cuffs, a picture of impeccable order. "Justice has been served, yes. But let us not forget, we have not solved the mystery of the human heart. That, Miss Amos, will forever remain the most dangerous puzzle of all." With that, Hercule Poirot took up his hat, stepped out into the cold night, and walked toward the station, leaving behind the faint scent of starched linen and the indelible sense that, for the moment at least, Stillingfleet slept safer beneath the watch of his little grey cells. Thus ends our journey into shadows and secrets with Hercule Poirot, Mrs. McGinty's dead. Another crime laid bare, another truth revealed by the brilliance of the little grey cells. If you enjoyed unraveling this mystery, I invite you to stay with us for more tales of suspense and deception. Do not forget to like this story, share it with fellow lovers of mystery, and subscribe to Moonlight Audiobook so you never miss the next case.